Hello, my name is Matthew, and this is going to be my first response video. A few weeks ago, I was watching a video from Shawn The Book Maniac. I've only recently discovered his channel. It's great. And he had a video about a book by Barbara Pym, An Academic Question. And not only did he hate the book, but he felt that because it was published posthumously, that it shouldn't have even been published at all. Apparently, Barbara Pym felt that the manuscript was substandard while she was alive and had a reason not to publish it. After her death, it was published anyway. And Shawn was disappointed in the writing of the book, and recommends not to read it, and it shouldn't have been published at all. And then he makes a general statement. He says, when writers die and they have stuff unpublished, you shouldn't publish it. He goes on to say, especially if you know based on diaries, journals, or letters that it wasn't fit for publication. And then it's a crime against literature. So at the time I left a comment, and as a counter argument mentioned all of the work of Franz Kafka, most of the work by Kafka, that the story is that he gave all these manuscripts to Max Brod, had a note that said basically just burn unread. And I can't remember if it was Shawn or someone else responded and just said, well, there's always an exception. And that's that. I was happy with that exchange. It was my first interaction on Shawn's channel, the first time I left a comment. I wish I would have said hello first, but... So just a few days ago, Shawn replied to me and asked if I would respond to another question, and he specifically said if you're so inclined to make a video. And so here we are. That's Daphne. So Shawn asked me, this is the question, I wrote it down so I wouldn't put words in anybody's mouth. Would you say, on the whole, that posthumous publications enrich or impoverish our readerly choices? So we have the first video and then this question. And the first thing, I think, to get myself on even ground and to make sure that I'm being as clear as I can, or as fair as I can, or whatever. If we're going to talk about posthumous literature as a genre, let's say, it's an unfairly high standard to say, does the majority of it enrich or impoverish our readerly choices? In general, most of the books in any genre, any classification, are bad. There's only just a very small portion of books that are satisfactory and good and terrific and go on to be classics. When we talk about books, we're basically always talking about the exceptions, not the forgotten books, not the books that you don't talk about. And there's a reason for that. You need a very wide net just to catch a very small amount. And I think that's an important point. And that's why it's almost unfair to say that pointing out Kafka is an exception, because all we ever talk about are exceptions. Anyway, so other than Kafka, I thought I would talk about some other writers that have been published posthumously that might make some other good examples. And so I'll start with another good one. William Shakespeare. And I pulled out my Norton anthology, and I'll just read a passage. Let's see. When Shakespeare died in Stratford in 1616, no collected edition of his plays had been published. Some of them had been printed in separate editions, quartos, without his editorial supervision, sometimes from his manuscripts, sometimes from Playhouse prompt books, sometimes from pirated texts secured by shorthand reports of a performance or from a reconstruction from memory by an actor or spectator. There is no evidence that Shakespeare wanted or approved to have his plays in print for the reading public. So the first folio was published after his death without his consent, and I would argue that as our collected culture, we are better for it. That might be an extreme case, and maybe you could argue that it's unfair. He wanted them on the stage, so they were finished products, but they were published posthumously. A list of other posthumous works. I'll go through the authors. Kafka. E.M. Forster had an unfinished novel when he died. So did Albert Camus. After his car accident, there was a manuscript in his trunk, I believe. Dickens, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, a murder mystery. It was a whodunit. Dickens didn't even write the part where we know who the murderer is. Why would he want that published? Not in its complete form. Henry James, Fitzgerald, Virginia Woolf, Flaubert. Bouvard and Picochet is one of my favorite novels. The last scraps of chapters where we just take small amounts of sketchy action towards the end of the book, Flaubert would have hated. He was a perfectionist. Hemingway, one of my favorite books by Hemingway, A Movable Feast. It was published posthumously. Nabokov, probably the closest comparison to Barbara Pym as far as how the stories go. David Foster Wallace. Stephen Hero by James Joyce, the early draft that was later on rewritten to be a Portrait of the Artist. Joyce literally threw it in the fire. What we have now was what was saved, the surviving parts that didn't burn. Marcel Proust, the last 3 of the 7 volumes in Search of Last Time were published posthumously and had to be stitched together from what Proust had written. He intended them for publication, but those last 3 volumes aren't exactly how Proust would have wanted them. We don't know how he would want them, but there you go. And it's unfair to say, are any of these as great as the greatest work by one of these authors? Is The Confessions of Felix Kroll by Thomas Mann as great as Magic Mountain? Well, it's an unfair ask from a writer. Can you write another novel that is better than what something is widely considered as the greatest novel of the 20th century, or one of the ones that are up there? You don't do that. You appreciate the good books. You don't begrudge the bad books, but you certainly lament the lost ones. Cassandra burnt a whole stack of Jane Austen's letters, gone forever. Charlotte Bronte supposedly destroyed a draft of one of Emily Bronte's novels, gone forever. Would you rather have unfinished manuscripts, things that you can kind of enjoy and imagine what they would have been like. Maybe not great, or just have story after story of things that could have been. And I'll go back. Shawn said, especially if you know based on diaries, journals, or letters that it wasn't fit for publication. And that's a good point. These diaries, journals, and letters, if we're to say that if it wasn't published in their lifetime, are also lost. Some of the greatest minds that ever lived writing things down. Presidents, monarchs, men of letters, novelists, poets. None of their private work should be published. None of the diaries, none of the letters from Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and John Keats and Shelley and Byron and on and on and on. They shouldn't be fit for the reading public, apparently. Private journals, like the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, never published in his lifetime. All of those kind of things, you might even say, that's also an unfair comparison, because letter writing was its own sort of art form. Some of these journals might have been intended to be published, specifically published after someone's lifetime. But what about the letters of Vincent van Gogh? He certainly had no dreams that one day his letters would be collected by Theo, saved. Vincent certainly didn't save Theo's letters. We're better off having them. The other point that could be made is that all of these kinds of works, unfinished manuscripts, things that were done without the writer's consent, could possibly either diminish the writer's reputation or taint the reputation of specific books, which is obviously untrue. Mark Twain wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and he wrote The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which also has Tom Sawyer in it. But he also wrote sequels. Let me write. I wrote it down. There's Tom Sawyer Abroad, Tom Sawyer Detective, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer Among the Indians, Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer's Conspiracy, Tom Sawyer's Gang Plan, Tom Sawyer's Gang Plans a Naval Battle. Most of those are unfinished. Some of them were published posthumously. Apparently they're all bad and forgettable. If you think about Tom Sawyer, you think of good old Tom from Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. Not these other ones. And they don't take anything away from the great things that people do. I'm trying to think if I'm missing anything. Oh, and the last thing I'll say is in Shawn's video, he talked about how Barbara Pym is one of his favorite writers, and he lists 4 of his novels that were his favorites of hers. And he mentions Crampton Hodnett, which is also a posthumous novel. He's planning on reading another posthumous novel by her as well. So I feel like the statement has more to do with just being disappointed in the quality of the writer, opposed to a reaction based on principle. Otherwise, you would think that you wouldn't want to be reading them at all. You would know that before you read it. So anyway, that's my thoughts. Posthumous literature is only a good. Let's see if I wrote anything. So if we were to talk of posthumous literature as a genre, the last thing I'll say is that it's a contradiction to say whether or not all the bad books impoverish our readerly choices. It's just contradiction. The more choices we have, the better. It only makes us better. Everything rises. So those are my thoughts on posthumous literature. I hope this was a friendly exchange with Shawn The Book Maniac. I'm going to leave a link to his video in question. If you don't already know of his channel, it's really terrific. And I'll end by asking, what do you think? What are your thoughts on posthumous books and things like that? So leave a comment if you would like, and thank you for watching.